Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. The motto for today's debate is, this House regrets the narrative that money cannot buy happiness. Representing the proposition, we have the team from Hong Kong, and on the opposition, we have the team from Greece. From the proposition side, our speakers are first speaker Rachel, second speaker Nicole, third speaker Edgar, and reply speaker Rachel. On the opposition side, our speakers are first speaker Leo, second speaker Alexia, third speaker Max, and reply speaker Alexia. Each speaker will have 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The first and last minute of each speech is considered protected time, during which points of information, POIs, may not be offered. The judges will signal the end of protected time at the 1 minute mark, after which POIs can be offered, and will signal the return to protected time at the 7 minute mark. At the 8th minute mark, they will give a double clap or ding to signal the end of the speech. Additionally, there will be 3 claps or dings at 8:15, and the judges will stop listening at 8:30. Best of luck to both teams. I now hand over the floor to our chair judge.
Overweighing immediate happiness and underweighing the risk of long-term shocks, people most affected by the narrative that money cannot buy happiness are misled to deprioritize their futures on opposition. 2 arguments in this speech. The first on why people are more likely to live responsible lives on our side. Second on why increase the political push for policies that benefit the poor. Before that, a couple points of setup. Firstly, what does this narrative look like? We think it largely sends a message that an increase in income or wealth will not make you more happy. So for instance, stories about how rich people feel unhappy at the top, or like media pushing narratives about how, for instance, like wealthy people are only being used for their wealth, etc. Who do we think that this most primarily affects? We think this affects everybody to some extent, but it disproportionately affects lower middle class or middle class people, because this is where the largest trade-off is, where you lack experience, where you potentially do not have the experience of having that additional income. If you are poor, we think that this is less likely to affect you because your material conditions and the harm of that likely outweighs most narrative, because you will likely be deeply dissatisfied on either side of the house. Lastly, what do we think the world would look like on our side of the house? We would support the narrative that money can buy happiness and that it is one factor that can bring you happiness. This is because the happiness that you derive from other aspects, like for instance, friends, family, your hobbies, are quite different. We think this has probably been socialized into you from a young age. You probably spent a lot of times with your parents, with your friends, right? You probably know that this does bring you a sense of fulfillment and happiness and meaning with you. You're likely to weigh it up as still as an important factor of happiness on either side of the house. Hence, we think this debate is about whether money is viewed as a factor in bringing you happiness. With that being said, on the first argument, why we're able to allow people to live more responsible lives. Different people have different priorities in life. For young people, the average short-term priority is to engage in hedonic pleasures, often at the expense of a career progression. This argument will prove why the belief that money can buy you happiness leads to people working far harder from a young age, therefore setting them up better for the long term. How do we think people are likely to interpret this narrative? First, let's be very clear about why the recipients of this narrative are more likely to be middle to lower income. We think people are more likely to opt into narratives that align with their circumstances, that tell them they are correct, that justify their actions. It is far easier to believe that you are living the good life rather than to take an objective look at your life and to recognize your weaknesses. This is because people often don't like to admit that they are wrong or that their choices in life are bad. What do we think that this means for the round? We think this means that people are likely to use this narrative to justify more irresponsible decisions. Why? First, people are largely short-termist and suffer from proximity bias. It is a lot easier to hang out with your friends in the short term, for instance, going on a boat trip rather than study. It's a lot more lucrative to go on a vacation rather than take the time to work harder for promotion right now, to look for a better position, because this is something that is proximate to you. This is something that is far easier when you are making that decision in that moment. Second, but let's be very clear here. We understand that there will be basic economic pressures on both sides of the house to work. But this debate and this clash is about whether you're likely to go beyond that baseline. On their side of the house, you're far more likely to opt into the pressures of hedonic, like these hedonic pressures, because they are the most proxy to right now, what feels good right now. How are we likely to change this on our side? Before that, yes.
80% of US citizens self-identify as middle class, even though 30% of them are below the poverty line. How does your narrative only affect the middle class then?
I mean, we say it affects everyone to some extent, but for people who are the middle class, this is probably when there's the greatest trade-off and where you think that, where we would want them to work hard. We think it's better for people. We would think it's better for people to have that financial security on either side of the house, but I'll go into more of that later. How are we likely to change this on our side? First, for many, I think this narrative is primarily transmitted, for instance, through your friends and family. When more people opt into the sentiment that money is important, that is when people are, for instance, more likely to be understanding when you say, oh, I can't get drinks tonight, I have to save up. But second, on our best case, I think people are more likely to view the importance of money when viewing their life trajectory, or prioritizing stability and long-term benefits. That is when you're likely to put the effort into working hard, to making sure that you're able to get that next promotion, to put in the effort to actually move up. Note, we think there are several reasons why you are unlikely to overwork yourself. First, there's a clear delineation between the narrative that money can buy happiness and that money should be the only thing that you care about. You still likely care about your health, about your friends and family, because this is still an integral part of your life and whether you can sustain yourself into the long term. This can factor into your decision making. But secondly, I think that this also interacts with an increasing amount of wellness culture in the corporate field. You need to know, more and more people are understanding of the fact that if you overwork people, you're likely to be less productive on either side of the house. Why do we think that this argument is really, really important for the round? First, on being insulated from risk in the future. I want to note that the likelihood of a shock event occurring in a person's life is incredibly, incredibly high, and it's really important to be able to pad yourself up for financial security. On a macro level, for instance, there could be a global recession, there could be a pandemic, there could be high levels of inflation while your wages aren't increasing. On a personal level, you never know when you're going to be placed into the hospital, if you could potentially lose your job, right? You could be injured, diagnosed with a sickness that you cannot be insured for, or if a family member may need money that you need to give them. All of this is to say that there are many different unforeseeable events in any person's future, which inherently requires money for you to overcome it. Without money in this situation, and importantly, saved up money that you have padded for, people end up being vulnerable to shock events in their life, which could completely derail their lives. We want people to make money in order to pad themselves from these events. Second, and missing out on opportunities. We think you're likely to miss out on things like promotions, which may have life-changing consequences for you in the future, which may allow you to access more happiness there. So for instance, having the ability to move into a safer neighborhood, of being able to move your parents out of their old home into a better neighborhood where they're able to where you're able to access more happiness, right? But lastly, just on financial independence, we think money is king, cash is king. When you have the money to do whatever you want, that is when you're more able to access opportunities that you were not able to do before. We think it's really important for people to not be relying on others, because that is when you can make the decisions that are best for you. Second argument then, and why we're better able to get political push for policies that benefit the poor. Politicians across the world weaponize the narrative that money is unrelated to happiness in order to deprioritize welfare for those who are highly vulnerable, as the poor are depicted to be content despite their economic conditions. In this argument, we will prove to you why the narrative that money can buy happiness leads to more support for welfare policies. How do people currently view poor people? In the majority of instances, we think people view poor people with some level of empathy. There's a general understanding that their lives are more difficult, that they're unhappy and unsatisfied with their circumstances. This is why most people do feel bad for those who earn less than them. But in most nations, we think those with the most voting power are those in the middle class. Statistically, they're the majority. They're educated and thus likely to turn out and vote. Politicians thus often cater to these people. Thus, the way that these people view poor people is quite important. Why does the narrative that money cannot buy happiness change how people view poor people? I think people in the middle class are more likely to think that although poor people are having difficult lives, they are still somewhat happy and fulfilled, that they find their happiness through other avenues, and thus that money is not a factor in increasing their happiness. This means that A, you're less likely to feel empathy for them, you're less likely to think that they need these policies to help them if they're already happy and they can find happiness through other avenues. But second, but B, even if you do feel bad for them, you don't believe that money will change their circumstances a lot and that they are individually unhappy, not because of structural reasons like being low on the economic ladder. Thus, you push for less things like increased welfare. Instead, you push for the money that would have, you are likely to oppose the money that would have gone to welfare to other things and policies that are more proximate to you. On our side of the house, where you do think money can buy happiness and that is an important factor in your happiness, you believe the primary way to make these people is to make more money, you're less likely to oppose policies that actually push for welfare and give income to these people. So on our side, this is really important because in the status quo, there are natural incentives already to decrease welfare and use that money for other things. To counterbalance this, it is really, really important to have more people push against this, to push this on the agenda.
Thank you very much for that speech. Will the first speaker of opposition to the podium please hear you?
Okay, man. In an overwhelmingly capitalistic society, it is debilitating to make the most core human aspiration contingent on the very thing that exploits and dehumanizes people: money. Happiness is neither achieved nor rooted in material goods. It is in the very essence of you and those around you. Do not let prop trap you in a worldview perpetuated by the very system they seek to combat: capitalism. What is this debate actually about? Firstly, we think when you say that money can't buy happiness, you don't mean that money can't buy you a good time. Obviously, if you get a new car, if you go on a trip, that might be kind of fun. The difference then is that our side believes that true happiness and contentment is found in family and friends, or the relationship that you create with them, or finding purpose within your community. This may be, for instance, believing that you are a father, for instance, and that your role within your family is to provide for your children in a way that teaches them lessons for the future, or believing that your role in life is to be an educator that teaches students at the local school things, or to be an artist that creates art that others can appreciate and relate with, right? We think this is often found either within your relationships or your hobbies and your passions. Secondly, what does the trade-off in this debate looks like? Because we think that proposition is obviously very convenient for them to not mention at all in their first argument where they tell you that you have more money, what the trade-off of this is, right? Because obviously this means that when you are working a higher paying job, when you're working more hours, that means you have less hours to spend with your family, less hours to spend on your passion. You probably do end up sacrificing relationships insofar as you don't go out, for instance, to try and meet new people as much, because when they say, oh, you won't buy drinks for people, that probably also means you won't go out to party to meet new people because your priority is money. I will show you why this means that on net people are less happy. But thirdly, we think that we think that the concept of money not buying happiness is something that a narrative that emerged to a larger degree as a counter-narrative, no thank you, to capitalist work culture, and we'll explain further why it is something that prevents a lot of exploitation. We'll argue a couple things. Firstly, why even when people make more money, engaging with proposition's best case, people are a lot less happy, right? Secondly, as to why people get exploited a lot more in proposition, actually have less money, something that they didn't really spend that much time showing to you. And thirdly, Alexia will talk to you about consumerism. What does prop tell you? The first thing they tell you is that people lead more responsible lives, right? That, they basically make more money because they make these small trade-offs. Obviously, proposition doesn't engage with what this actually means for people in terms of why, the relationships, etc., that they compromise. My first argument will explain why even if you have more money, this is still worse for you. But I want to note here that their second argument is about how you have more poor people, narrative and policies, right? The first thing I want to note is that for the exact reason that they say that poor people are out of this debate, by the way, very convenient for them, I'm going to explain why poor people are actually a group that is affected a lot by the narrative. But, the need that people face in terms of they need to pay rent, this is a difference to happiness, right? So we think if the need that you see in people around you is not enough to be something that motivates you to engage in poor individual policy, then we don't see why thinking that money is what buys happiness for these people is something that is actually the tipping point for that. But secondly, I actually think people are going to act more selfishly when they think money is what buys their happiness. As a middle class person, for instance, on proposition, a person is much more likely to be unwilling to give their own taxpayer dollars to help the poor people, for instance, because they recognize that this is coming at a direct cost to their happiness. It is only when you recognize that happiness is found mostly in the relationships that you have that you're more willing to divorce yourself of the money that you do have to actually help those around you cover their needs. So we flip that argument. We think actually you get a lot less policies of that kind on proposition. Our first argument then is that people are much happier on opposition because in the absence of the narrative that money can't buy you happiness, money is seen as the best way to get happiness. Why is money seen as the best or maybe even only way to get happiness on proposition? Firstly, it's much more visible than anything else, right? It's a much easier way to quantify how happy someone is if you can just measure it by how much their watch costs or how much their car costs or what their wage is. Versus with something like relationships, can you quantify if someone has a skip in their step or how fun they are in that sense? It's much harder to do. So it's much easier rather to consider wealth and money to be the metric of happiness on proposition. That's what people focus on a lot more. But secondly, because we think the common narrative of capitalism is something that pushes people into considering already money to be the priority. So we think propositions like narrative actually plays into that capitalist narrative. Why? Because your time is measured in money, because you have incentives from advertising companies, etc., to make you believe that money is your worth. We think proposition plays into that. Why, therefore, are people significantly happier on opposition, even granting them, this idea that they have more money on their side? Firstly, because we think, and here I'll be comparing basically money compared to passions and relationships and why it's a lot worse. Firstly, because people are structurally locked out of money, right? We think what you're good at, these skills you have, are largely arbitrary. They're based on where you are and the scarcity that exists there. We think many people are have wealth because of what they inherited from their family, because of the education that their family could pay for. The majority of people die in the same income quintile that they were born in. This also affects middle-class people, but I also, which they want to talk about exclusively, but I also think it significantly affects poor individuals, which they conveniently want to not talk about. Versus things like relationships or hobbies are much easier to come by, because there's so many of them, right? It's so diverse, so it's reliant largely to you seeking them out, and wanting to go and, for instance, try painting, try all of these things. We think it's easier to do that. Therefore, crop is devastating for those who have an inability to get much more money. But secondly, no thank you, because money is inherently comparative. It's so much more tangible, as I've explained, so you're always going to be comparing it to what other people have. There's always going to be someone who has, a better watch than you. And actually, we think the companies and the advertising companies have an additional incentive to try and portray this as comparative. That when you get more wealth, your Facebook thing notices that, and it starts giving you ads of things that are even more expensive. So you feel poor all the time. Additionally, we think people often conceal the fact that their wealth is inherited, for instance. Versus the subjectivity of activities means that if Sia is reading a book and that's her thing, I don't feel envy towards her because maybe I don't like books that much and I'm more into painting. So I don't have this sense of envy. It's not that comparative. But thirdly, because money is inherently insatiable, right? You can always get more of it. You always want more of it. Therefore, even if proposition gets more money, best case, they don't actually tell you why that's not likely, as I've explained, people are less happy. We think the happiest people are based on the rankings and stuff, are in the Caribbean, right? Versus in places like Japan, for instance, which have a much heavier work culture, what proposition wants to emphasize more, you have a lot more people dying in some instances of suicide, but at the very least being more anxious, more stressed. I'll take it to you, Anna.
If you are literally living in these slums, do you think that your narrative of I have art as a hobby means that they can overcome the dissatisfaction of not being able to pay their rent?
Okay, so now it is about poor people. Cool. If it is about poor people, then they're structurally locked out of wealth. You're just making them feel a lot worse. At the very least, on our side, they can recognize that they could be happy if they focus on their relationships. And by the way, I do think, yes, even if you are poor as a person, you can absolutely find happiness through your role as a person in your family, etc. I'll finally very quickly tell you why people are exploited a lot more in proposition. Quite simply, because there exists a very significant trade-off between pressuring your government and unionizing, for instance, and actually making money from your job. Why? Firstly, because it compromises things like promotions, right? Because your boss is less likely to like you if you're participating in a union. Secondly, even though these laws exist in some places, you might even get fired, even if it's illegal sometimes. Thirdly, at the very least, there's an opportunity cost in terms of what your time is doing. Therefore, we think people are more likely to pick working harder and doing exactly what their boss tells them, as opposed to unionizing and saying no, because there's a much higher certainty of outcome. If you continue working, put your head down, do what your boss tells you, you're much more certain to make money. If you want to sacrifice that to unionize, you make less money. Therefore, on proposition, people get exploited a lot more. People are not able to protest and push for the exact policies that proposition wants. For all of these reasons, vote opposition.
Thank you very much for that speech. And will the second speaker on the proposition for the voting, please? Here,
Okay. I just want to do an audio test. Is it okay if I speak at this volume and at this pace? Because I've been getting issues with audibility, so it's good? Okay. They've misunderstood our claim on poor people. Because I actually think poor people works better on our side of the house. Because when they say you can access other things, like finding hobbies, like spending lots of time with your family, like actually prioritizing them in a really big way, I'd actually argue these narratives are even more inaccessible for poor people. That you're often very busy working your job, you're working 2 jobs a day, you barely have time to go home and put food on your table and talk to your family in the first place. So for the 30% of people below the poverty line that they identify, who do not have time to actually go painting, for instance, or read a book every Sunday because they are too busy working to put food on the table, that's when you actually don't have the ability to opt into these other narratives. So on whether or not poor people are happy, I think we actually flip this. Because on our side, it is probably better that you view money as a means to happiness. That you say, if I work harder, if I get more money, if I actually provide for my family through my job, I would actually be happy eventually, long time in the future. On their side, you're locked into an inaccessible narrative. And you simply do not have the time or effort to care about all the things that they care about on their side. At their side, it's actually fundamentally far more inaccessible. Given this then, we flip direct claim on poor people being happy, we actually take this clash in this sense. I have 4 things I'm going to do in my speech then. Number 1, I want to prove to you that you just view money as a way, but the way to get happiness, which actually takes out their entire constructive case. Secondly, I want to talk to you about how hard people work, because I'll show you why we actually get benefits in this case. Thirdly, I want to talk to you about why people spend their money more responsibly, which actually flips their claim on people not spending their money greatly. And finally, on political support, which they mostly drop, they gave a flippant response to. Firstly then, do you view money as a way for happiness or the only way for happiness? Because their claim here is you view money as the only way, and therefore that's devastating for our case. They give you 2 reasons as to why this is the case. They say money is quantifiable, whereas other things aren't quantifiable. Sure, maybe in numerical terms, money is quantifiable, but you can obviously spot differences in other things. If your wife is more happy because of things you're saying to her, if you're more happy with playing the piano, for instance, because you have played the piece that you want to play, obviously there's quantifiable differences in the hobbies and in the relationships that you have. Therefore, I think it's also, you can just clearly see the differences, as this isn't a metric in which this is judged as to whether it is a way to happiness. The more important thing that they say then is that this plays into capitalism. That capitalism is a very big part of your life, and therefore you would view this as an important happiness. Capitalism is a pressure in society, but once again, it is by no means the only pressure. The flaw in their cases, they are very extreme. They give you absolutes. They say capitalism is dominating in this sense. It is obviously not for reasons we gave in P1. That as you are a child, you often socialize into your family, for instance, and you view your family as very important to you. That you often have friends in school, for instance, and you view them as very important. That you often have things that you like doing apart from your time, apart from working, so you also view those as very important as well. Therefore, even if you say that money can buy happiness, it does not invalidate all the other means that people can find happiness. Then you can still do other things, right? Talk to your friends, talk to your family, and you will still view this as bringing you happiness. But the most important thing on our side was to prove that you just get validated, right? When you talk to your friend, that makes you happy. Maybe the external narrative tells you that money can also buy you happiness, but from your own experience, this other thing also give you happiness. Therefore, I think this is we prove to you conclusively that it's just one way of happiness. That money definitely can buy you happiness, but other things can too. This therefore takes on their first argument as to why you won't just have hustle culture and overwork yourself all day, and you also focus on other things, for instance. That on our side, we're actually counterbalancing the incentives for you to work. And you work harder on our side, but this means you work the appropriate amount. On their side, you work too little, you don't have a safety net, and it is far worse on their side. Given this then, their entire case is contingent on this, we win the round because we prove this. How hard do people work then? Before that, sure.
If money is just another way to be happy, and relationships are just another way to be happy, how does your first argument in terms of making trade-offs to prioritize money over your relationships actually work?
Yeah, you would trade it off in some cases. That is good. You trade it off more. It's not an absolute, right? You don't just view money as the only way, and you put your 100% of your effort in money. You also don't view family as your only way, and you're 100% in that. You also have a balance of both. On our side, we shift the balance towards working more. That is good. That's not an absolute as they argue in their first. They've strawmanned us. Okay, how hard do people work then? Our claim from the beginning was that people make bad decisions surrounding their future. They work too little, they often don't work enough, and they have balanced far too much towards life and not enough towards their future. This is because they overestimate their own circumstances. And this is actually where the PY to us plays into our case, that they say 80% of people believe they're middle class, but they're actually mostly poor. Yes, that is true. That is why we want people to work more, that in times of recession, for instance, that when you get laid off from your job, you have a better safety net under our side of the house. And it's fine for us to take this trade-off that you work slightly more, and you slightly, you have a better, maybe it is true that you, actually spend less time, but you still spend sufficient time. It's just you shift the balance a little bit. Given this then, what are their reasons as to why people just don't need to work more or already have enough money? They give you two reasons. Number one, lots of people are poor, so they cannot access jobs anyway. Look, this identified the wrong group in the round. They have strawmanned us by telling us that it's about poor people. No, for this mechanism of working more, I think it's the majority of individuals that can work more. That there are people who are lower middle class that can choose to work more hours, for instance, that they would do so on our side. That there are other groups of individuals who just generally work a part-time job instead of working a full-time job, and I work a full-time job on our side of the house. This is a very broad group of people. Our claim is you probably do work slightly more, that is good. And even in the majority of cases, if you work more hours, it just necessitates you getting more pay, right? That's just probably how it works in the real world. So you work more, you probably do get more pay as well. So maybe it's true. You can't access wealth, but you can access slightly more money. That is good for all the impacts that we talked to you. That having, being able to bear risk is better. And you just have more of a safety net in your bank account. So when your recession hits or you get laid off, you actually have a safety net under our side of the house. The second thing then is they want to flip our argument in the second argument, where they say you are actually more exploited because you have a race to the bottom because you are able to accept bad working conditions. Look, if you say poor people are the group that is the most important, they're the ones who are equally as exploited. This is because poor people often have a shortage of jobs. They often compete for labor as a whole. Therefore, I think for this group of individuals, they will probably be equally as exploited on both sides of the house because they just really need the money in the first place. Therefore, I think exploitation is probably very symmetric, and you don't don't get that unique harm on their side. Our unique benefit then, that they did not engage with, that you often work more, you work longer hours, but yes, when you come home from work, you will still spend time with your family. But even then, you have more money, and you're able to just get better quality of life. And you save more money in your bank account, for instance, and you probably buy a house eventually, or rent a bigger apartment that gives you material comfort for your family. Maybe it is true that initially you don't view as happiness. When you actually do get these benefits, that's when you're actually happy, that you actually make better life choices that affect you into the future, that in the long term, in the 20 years, the planning that you've done earlier, that you worked more, actually pays off for the rest of their life. Therefore, this is the most important issue in the round, because we prove to you, not only do the poor people work more, just everyone works slightly harder, you get slightly more money, which is better for your life at the end of the day. Maybe we lose in the short term, but in the long term, when you actually have a safety net, you actually outweigh all these short-term harms that they give you even in the best case. Okay, as we want to help people spend their money then, look, there are two plausible ways that people interpret this narrative. A, there are a subset of people who are risk-averse, who often use the narrative of money cannot buy happiness to become increasingly stingy and not spend all their amount, because they view the material goods and hedonistic experiences as being unable to buy happiness. But B, there's a different subset of individuals who are very lax with their money and view money cannot buy happiness as an excuse to spend more. That when people say, when you're out with your friends, for instance, they say, oh, money can't buy happiness, so you might as well just get drinks with us out. The removal of this narrative brings both of these different groups of individuals towards the center. And I just don't know, they will call it a contradiction. It's not a contradiction. It's just two different ways this narrative is interpreted. For the extreme risk-averse person, they're often more likely to just go on trips in the first place. They're often not likely to buy treats for themselves, for instance. This makes you more happy in the long run, because you actually spend more money on yourself, and you give yourself pleasures in the first place. So if their case is on hobbies, you actually get this group of people to spend far more time on their hobbies, for instance, because you actually are willing to use your money for this in the first place. But secondly, for the extreme money spender who just spends beyond their means, means? This means you're willing to actually spend less, because you save for bigger or more reasonable purchases than you would do on our side of the house. So for both these groups of people, you actually have far better spending habits. So even if we don't win the first clash, which we do win, the second issue when you spend your money responsibly actually falls to our side. Therefore, if you have the same amount of money, that's fine, you still win this clash and just takes us to the round. Finally then, really quickly, just want to engage in the political support for redistribution. Look, their only glib response here was that poor people, you're just going to be equally as selfish on both sides, so you don't want to help them in the first place. But our claim was never this. Our claim was the rhetoric that politicians often use to galvanize individuals to actually voting for welfare. On our side, it is far more effective. Because when you say that money can actually buy happiness, and that's what you prioritize, that oftentimes is maybe you're equally as selfish on both sides, you probably can't change that. But what you can change is how politicians convince people that on their side, you say money can't buy happiness, so you shouldn't have them in the first place. On our side, maybe it is true. We don't have a tipping point, but we're able to substantially get the amount of rhetoric changed, and we're actually able to get more support for the redistribution, and you actually spend more of your money on poor individuals because you believe that they can get happiness through this way.
Thank you very much for that speech. Will the next speaker of the opposition to the podium?
Excuse me, would it be okay if I lift this up and I use the table? Thank you. Oh. All right. Is it okay if I move? Thank you. Happiness is something that everyone in this room and in this world can have. Money, unfortunately, is something that not everyone can acquire, because there are people that are structurally locked out of accessing it, and at the point where Proposition wants a world in which happiness is achieved through money, people demand more and more of this to achieve that happiness. But there's a vast majority which will never be able to get that additional margin and will therefore never be able to be happy. And Proposition's world is one in which it tells a black person or a lower middle income person who wants to climb up the social ladder that it's their fault for being unhappy because they could have worked hard enough, but they didn't. Proposition's world is one that perpetuates the very harmful narrative that capitalism has been guilt-tripping individuals for centuries. We're very proud to oppose. 3 things then in this speech. Firstly, what does Proposition actually have to defend, and why are they weaseling out of the very thing that they're meant to prove? Secondly, some rebuttal on the policies then that they're trying to establish, for the poor in their second argument, which engages with our second argument. And thirdly, my own argument as to why people are exploited as consumers with the perpetuation of this narrative. Firstly then, what does Proposition have to actually defend? Because they tell you in a setup point that they're going to still weigh family as important because money is only going to be a single factor. I think opposition does this because they realize 2 things. First, that they can't defend money being the main way with which you can gain happiness because truly they don't really believe their own case. But secondly, they know that a lot of people won't be able to access this money, so they try to backtrack and tell you defensively from first that, oh, this is just one factor. But let's just look as to why this isn't true and why it's so problematic. The first reason for this is because we told you there's necessarily an opportunity cost. And this is implicit in Proposition's first argument. They just tell you that you have to weigh one thing over the other in order to make it worth. Therefore, based on their own mechanizations, there has to be some kind of trade-off, which Leo already told you why it's not worth it. Because family is so much more important, because these have to do with the actual humans that you interact, because this has to do with something that is intrinsic to your environment and can form meaningful connections with which you can have emotions. This is so much more important, and they're making a trade-off that's not worth it. But secondly, the reason why there necessarily has to be a trade-off is because money is perceived to be a lower barrier under their side to access that happiness. happiness. That is to say that even if you don't directly have to make a trade-off, it just seems easier for you to try and, for example, like, work more in your job than it is to entirely change what that job is, because that would make you happier. Because money, under their narrative, seems easier. So they're more likely to prioritize money to a large extent, which means then that don't let them get away with this defensive stance of, no thank you, it's only one factor. It has to be the main factor, or a really big one, for their entire case to work. Second thing that I want to address then, which is at this point where both teams clash on what policies look like for the poor, and note that both their second argument and our second argument interact with this. They tell you, no thank you, that most people feel bad about the poor, but people now think that poor aren't happy enough, and so that's why you're going to pressure for things like welfare, like policies. I think this isn't true, because in a capitalistic society, there's an inherent pressure for upward social mobility. What this means is, first, that the lower class is very likely to be blamed for not working hard enough within the world that we live in right now, at the point where they're more likely to be seen as not making that trade-off, or not be willing to make that trade-off. But the problem is that in a lot of instances, as Leo told you in his first speech, is that people cannot make that trade-off, no thank you, because even if they do, they're still structurally locked out of being able to access more money because of geographic reasons, because of inherent biases, because of wealth inheritance, right? Some people aren't just lucky to have a really, really rich dad, right? We think that there's a lot of reasons as to why people are unable to make this trade-off. Secondly, we think that welfare under their side is more likely to be seen as a loss of taxpayer money because it comes at the cost of the vast majority of people, that is the very middle class, that they say feel sympathy for the poor. Well, now, under their side, they don't feel sympathy for the poor. They say that they're taking out their main way of happiness. I think this is a catastrophic view to perpetuate for poor people, especially in a world which there already is wealth inequality and disproportionate harm and biases against them. But thirdly, they entirely assert that the most likely outcome is pushing for welfare. We think that in an individual's consumerist world, what you're more likely is to want to tell the poor and the black person, work harder. But the problem is that no matter how hard they work, they won't be able to get that higher money. And this is where our impacts come in, right? The fact that people feel inherent guilt for failing not just themselves, but their entire family, all the way to more magnified effects where they commit suicide because of that failure, or because there's this consistent cycle where even if they do overcome those barriers, they feel guilty for not doing enough because there's always a chance and an ability to gain more money. But fourthly, we told you that our side is the one that's more likely to help the poor, because we know that the issue doesn't lie in them not having money. It's an issue which is in a much broader system, such as that of discrimination. If you work more hours but have less labor protections because no one pushes for them, you're so much worse. This is our second argument that proposition doesn't respond to. The fact that there's a great opportunity cost of you, for example, unionizing, because you know that that is loss of income, which in their world also gets you happiness, because you know that that is might get you fired, right, from your boss. And so all of the labor protections are so much more likely under our side. We are the ones that protect the poor. Finally, very quickly, on how they say that they better set up people for the long term. I think that the reason why this argument is problematic is because they don't engage with the fact that for money to be able to buy you happiness, it also means that you spend that money. And so what this happens is that costs accumulate a lot for the very people that they're trying to get them to save up. Because if the trade-off is me, for example, staying at home, on another time, it will be, for example, to be able to buy, for example, a different kind of, I don't know, thing to study with. All of the money that can buy you happiness is also money spent. And so I think that this is an argument that is irrelevant by the end of my speech. So before I move on to my own argument then, as to why you're exploiting consumers through this narrative, yes?
Maybe you do buy a thing that you can study with, but you also have more money on our side because you work harder, you did overtime, so you have more pay. Why then is the trade-off like symmetric?
So I think that the problem with what you're saying is the fact that at the point where you say that you're trying to save up for something like life-threatening surgery, which is your example, or being able to move on to a better neighborhood, this is also money that you think you are willing to spend on achieving that happiness. But the problem with this is that it doesn't address the real issue. That is to say that if, for example, you're happy because you're able to buy your way out of a life-threatening surgery, our side of the house is a narrative which tells you, yes, you bought your way through that life-threatening surgery, but the important thing is that your parent was actually able to live through that that. The fact that you got to spend more time with them, not the fact that you were able to buy the surgery in the first place. That is the difference. It's not about symmetricizing the cost. Obviously, we can't do that because it's a debate. We don't have the numbers. The point is the approach to which you're able to see the problem and through which lens. Was money a means to that happiness, or is it actually the very goal? Your side thinks that money is the goal. Third argument then from our side, that in a world in which people believe money can't buy happiness, means people are less likely to be exploited as consumers. What do companies do in the status quo? Firstly, they play off the capitalistic pressure that material goods significantly improve how you feel, and secondly, it plays on insecurities. Things like vulnerable women, for example, like feeling more confident in what they wear. The problem is that this narrative then exploits people's internal issues. Why? Firstly, because it guilt trips them into buying more. Products designed to not make you happy, right? The fact that you have to buy packs or upkeep new trends to buy that happiness of feeling good for yourself. Under our side, you're much more likely to question this. The impact of this is first, that costs accumulate over a long term because you have to buy a lot of things to achieve that happiness, but also they accumulate over a long period of time. But the second is that this is a cycle of unhappiness. There's always something more that you can get, and so you're always trapped in this idea of needing to spend more to be happier, and this exploits people's insecurities and is catastrophic. Opposition.
Thank you very much for that speech. We will third speaker on the proposition to the podium. Here to
Do you mind if I put this back on?
Most couples, even those that are not very well off, have a fund set aside for emergencies. Many parents, even those that are not very well off, have a college fund set up for their kids. The reason why they do this is because while they recognize they could blow that college fund on a all-expenses-paid two-person vacation to Bali, they recognize that there are more responsible things that they could do with that money. They recognize that there are things which are important in this world that beyond hedonistic pleasure and beyond things that can make you happy today. There are things that can make you happy tomorrow, which might require more money. The reason why this is important is because the narrative that money cannot buy happiness causes people to overrate their current sensory pleasures, as they say things like art, rather than actually taking an objective look at their lives, at the circumstances that they're living in, and questioning whether they could seek out more opportunities, questioning whether they are being responsible right now. I'm going to tell you about three things. First, I'll explain to you why many middle-lower people in the status quo can make reasonable decisions that give them more financial stability. Secondly, I'll tell you why, even to the extent that people do make trade-offs, why these trade-offs are likely to be worth it to them, why they can make these assessments correctly. Finally, I'll tell you about politics, and I'll tell you about why the narrative that money cannot buy happiness becomes overly weaponized by politicians against welfare. But before all of that, just a few discrete responses to their new arguments. They tell you, first of all, that many people are going to be engaged in a race to the bottom. That in places like Japan, you're going to get workers competing with each other to see who can take the most overtime and see who can get the lowest amount of wages. I think this is probably untrue. In these kinds of places, there are external economic conditions that mean that these people prioritize their financial well-being. For instance, in Japan, the idea that there are rapid instances of inflation mean that there are high economic barriers, there are high financial incentives that apply to both sides of the house. Incidentally, this is also why poor people, poor people largely cannot be helped on their side. Because to the extent that there are financial barriers to you that are so high, that there are dire financial straits that are so high on either side of the house, the fact that you are literally hungry, the fact that you can't keep the lights on, are likely to push you towards getting a job on either side of the house. What we then told you in Nicole's speech was that for these people who probably cannot set aside the time to do a painting, who cannot even buy art supplies in the first place to make that nice little painting, is that for these people, it's far more important that they believe that their pursuits are going to be worth it, that money is going to bring them happiness. And I'll tell you next on why they are able to pursue that happiness later. The second new thing they tell us is that consumers are exploited because of advertising. Panel, I want to repeat this, that the reason why advertising works is because it tells you that money can buy happiness. This seems intuitively untrue. The reason for this is because many products that are sold to individuals are not sold just on promising you that money buys happiness. It is telling you that this product is better than other products. It is telling you that this product sells you a certain lifestyle. It is telling you that there are certain appealing parts of this product. It is not the case that this product is going to revolutionize your life. It is the case that there are specific benefits and disadvantages to using it. Firstly then, why do many people in the status quo actually have the capacity to make decisions that give them stability? And I want to note, I think their characterization on this has been very extreme. Yes, there are structural barriers that exist in place that mean that maybe the poorest of individuals cannot become billionaires, or even most people can't become billionaires. But what we told you, that was never the contention. What we told you was that for most individuals, the difference is what you do with your disposable income. Do you save it, for instance? Do you invest it? Or do you spend it tomorrow? So the main difference, the key difference on either side of the house is when you do have leftover bits of money, are you more likely to use that responsibly or not? This is not a question. But secondly, we told you it was about opportunities that you can pursue. That is to say, when you're a kid fresh out of college, it may seem very lucrative to you to go on a beach trip with your friends, but you also might be able to use that summer networking, to get a part-time job, to get an internship. These are opportunities that are both equally accessible to you, that there is no clear barrier as to why one is impossible and the other is possible. But the problem is, the decisions you make now will affect the long-term things in the future. That if you network now, you can probably, you are more likely to be able to get a promotion in the future. These are the decisions that are most likely to occur on our side of the house. Finally, but let us also talk about social inequality, because we recognize that there are people, for instance minorities, who are going to be, for whom it is more difficult for them to be able to climb up the social ladder. This is unfortunate and it is regrettable. However, the difference on either side of the house is whether they are more likely to take those opportunities in the first place. Note that the barrier facing many minorities is that they self-select out of opportunities because they believe that they cannot do it, or because they believe that they cannot do it, they believe that they are not worth it, they believe that, for instance, they were raised in an environment where they believe that financial opportunities were outside of their reach. On our side of the house, when we tell them that money can buy you happiness, we tell them that money is one of the ways in which you are able to improve your material circumstances, you're more likely to weigh these more heavily. That means for the black person who's always told by their parents or who didn't have good financial role models from their parents, they're more likely to take those opportunities in the first place to pursue them. Maybe they cannot become substantially more wealthy, but that was never the point. The point was that they're more insulated from shocks. The point was that when things go wrong, that they have more things to fall back on. That was a very clear and more reasonable difference that we defend on our side of the house. Before we move on to the POI.
I get that thinking money buys you happiness means to chase money more. Cool, we're good there. Why does thinking that money can buy you happiness imply that you save money rather than spending it on things that make you happy?
Okay, I think there's just a few different interpretations of how this narrative could go. Nicole already explained to you how there are different interpretations, and she already answered them. I'm not going to repeat her analysis, but the summary is, first, the idea that money can buy you happiness is not the same thing as you ought to spend all of your money right now. This is very clearly not what most people believe. Most people believe that money is important to your circumstances, that money is important to your life. That is to say that you have to be wise about the way in which you spend your money. This is the more reasonable interpretation. The next thing I'm going to tell you is, the next thing I'm going to tell you is about why, to the extent that people make trade-offs, the trade-offs are likely to be worth it. Because I think they've been very absolutist in their stance. The idea that if you believe money is important, you cannot spend any time with your family, you can't spend any time with your friends. I don't think this is true. Most of us have at least one working parent, and we still probably have a relationship with them. Like most people, after they come home from work, can spend time with their family and friends. Maybe all they have proven on their side of the house is you cannot do the exact same things at the same time. That is to say, you cannot spend the exact same time at work and at home. But predominantly, these things are important important to both people. Why was this framing important? We told you, first of all, that there are far too many reasons why people are likely to opt into the easy way out. Why many people want to be lazy, why many people want to be selfish, and people want to justify their decisions to themselves. That is to say, you want to believe that you're making the right choice. You want to believe that you're making the right choice. And note, it is far easier for you to believe. It is far easier for you to just sit at home or spending time with your friends and family, because that is a lower cost alternative to actually going back to work, to taking overtime. That is the reason why there's an asymmetry in choice in the status quo. What this narrative does is that it perpetuates this asymmetry. It tells you that there was no point going back to work anyway, because this money would not have substantially changed your life. What we do is we change that. The final thing I'll tell you is about how this is likely to be weaponized against welfare. And I think the response to this have not observed reality. They tell you that the narrative is not a tipping point. Actually, oftentimes it is. Because in order for you to vote on an issue, you have to believe that this issue is a problem in the first place. The problem that we characterize to you is that many individuals in the status quo see these people who are poor and see that they're destitute. Maybe they'll have some empathy, but the problem is the narrative tells them that these people could find happiness in their own lives if they go out to paint or if they stay inside and read books. Therefore, you believe that giving them more wealth or giving them more money may, for instance, improve their material conditions, but is not actually going to improve their overall level of happiness. So if you believe in what opposition tells you, that staying indoors and painting or doing things like that is able to bring you fulfillment, then you are the exact same voter who's going to fall for that kind of rhetoric or fall for that kind of propaganda. On our side of the house, the fact that money can buy you happiness and the fact that you believe money is a substantial source of happiness in many people's lives is what causes you to believe that people who are structurally locked out from opportunities ought to be afforded those opportunities in the first place. It is only when you believe that money is a significant way in which people are able to access better things, like a roof over their heads or food on the table, that you're far more likely to feel compassion and feel empathy for individuals who cannot otherwise access it.
Thank you very much for that speech. We call the third speaker of the opposition to the podium. Please, your turn.
The reason why proposition flip-flops between first and second, from saying it's just about the middle class to this is about the people living in the slums of Mumbai, I guess, and the reason why they try to minimize all of their impacts about saying this is just about the narrow amount of disposable income you have is because they understand their case doesn't make sense. I find it exceptionally weird that they base most of their things on stability when this is the exact reverse thing they are getting. I'll talk to you about two things in my speech. First of all, where people are happiest, and second of all, where there is less exploitation and more protections for the poor and vulnerable. But let's first address the whole thing they say about stability on the question of happiness. First of all, we think that people are rational enough to do what they are trying to do in a lot of instances. Like saving up for surgery isn't something you do to be happy, it is something you do so your child doesn't die. And if this is about the middle class, they're a fairly stable income group wise. They have that stability generally speaking. And we think that even to the extent to which these people might be more oriented towards saving and stability, we think this is completely counteracted by what Alexia told you in her third argument. The fact that you create much more pressures to consume, a much more consumerist lifestyle means that even if you're saving up more, you're also spending more of that money because you think that what you need to spend on increases. So even if your propensity to save increases, so does your propensity to consume, therefore this balances out. But let's also be very clear about how weird what they're saying is. Because look, if spending money is your pathway to happiness, and if as proposition 1 says people are short-sighted and have a quote-unquote proximity bias, that they're more likely to assess what is immediately happy for them, this is what leads to hedonistic spending. This is what leads to you spending on that very nice steak restaurant rather than saving up. When money is about stability, basic needs, not happiness, that is when you are much more likely to save. So we think that to the the extent to which they want people to be making sound long-termist financial choices, you are not doing that proposition. You're coercing and pressuring people away from those decisions you seem to like. Let's talk about happiness then. 3 things. First of all, why there is a trade-off between other forms of happiness and money. Second of all, why money is an exceptionally bad way of getting happiness. And third, why happiness needs to be the priority. First of all, why is there a trade-off? We think very simply, independent of the reasons Leo told you in first, time. Because for them to have a higher income so you can save more, etc., you need to be working a lot of time. And we think making money is also much more proximate. It is easier for you to say, I'm going to work a few more hours to have more income, than do all of the difficult legwork of trying to be a good dad or explore your passions. They describe these things as if it's the easiest thing, to have a complex emotional relationship with someone, to understand their struggles, even though you're like 30 years older than them and you don't know what a TikTok is. That is much more difficult than staying longer time in your office to make more money because you think that is what will make you and your family more. And we think that to the extent to which there is more of a trade-off, this means A, you have less time with your family, but also B, less time to socialize so you can get a family. This is why in Japan and South Korea people are not marrying and having kids, because they're working all of the time, and now the government is trying to introduce programs, but not even those are working because people are doing this type of thing proposition is telling you. It's also telling that they never engage with the real world, because never once have we heard where this narrative applies to you by them. You know why? Because they know where it applies, and they know that it applies to the place where suicide rates are the highest, because they know that white, affluent men are the demographic much more likely to commit suicide than any else. They know all of this, but they don't tell you because they are disingenuous. Second then, why is this a very bad way of being happy? We told you it is inaccessible, and the response is, oh, poor people have all of these opportunities, they're just not taking them. That is, I would say, quite patronizing. We think in the vast majority of cases, for the millions in South Africa who never had access to property or education, to the people who live and die in the same quintile as their families, we think that is untrue. We also tell you that it is a way to get happiness which uniquely causes envy, and is also inherently insatiable, because there's an industry with an incentive to make you feel like your one vacation wasn't enough, so you then go on a second one, and because this is by the nature of the product something which you will, like, literally eat and then poop out, so it doesn't really stay with you that much. Why? And also they tell you that you can't afford your hobbies and passions. Passions are not something in the ether. You can find passions which you can afford. Maybe your passion is bird watching, that's pretty cheap. Maybe your passion is reading, download a PDF online. These are fairly accessible. Then we'll tell you something very simple. Happiness is the priority, because their case about money and stability at the end of the day is also about happiness, and like happiness and the relationship you have are what allow you to weather economic shocks, is what you will remember on your deathbed, not how much hedonistic consumption you did. Clearly then, happiness is the priority, and you get this more under our side when you do realize that money cannot buy it. I'll take the POI.
Your first speaker tells us that relationships are really easy to access and maintain. You tell us relationships are highly difficult and require time commitment. Which one of you is wrong and why?
We tell you that relationships are something you can access independent of wealth. We're not saying this is easy, this is why you need time. The reason why they are easier to access is because they are not arbitrary, because attractiveness is subjective, because personalities and being attractive is subjective. That is something everyone has the capacity to access. When you don't have marketable skills, when you don't have education, that is when you're arbitrarily locked out of income and locked out of your pathway to happiness. That is what happens under your side proposition. Then, let's talk about exploitation. Because look, proposition starts in saying they're going to be giving more money to the poor people, more welfare, etc., because they have an incentive to give because they can access happiness. First of all, they never establish why this is the tipping point, why it being about happiness rather than basic needs, which is what we say under your side, means you get more money. I would argue that we actually have more money going to the poor. Why? Because when it is about basic needs, not happiness, it's much less zero sum. Because look, under both sides, you need to transfer wealth and income from the middle class and the upper class to the lower classes. When this is about us losing some of our income for their basic needs, that is a trade-off you can much more easily make. When it's a one-to-one comparison of happiness for happiness, because happiness scales with money, that is much more likely, that is when you're much less likely to be empathetic, because you're trading on a one-to-one basis. Ours is the side which tells you you're meeting a much more basic need. Ours is the side which is much more likely to get things like welfare, etc. Then let's talk about exploitation. We told you very simply in our first speech that you have more exploitation because you understand that you're not going to risk your happiness for a collective good, and that the policies which you try to push under their side are the exact type of policies which don't necessarily give access to income, but actually are like use the veneer of income to exploit workers. Things like supporting the gig economy, things like supporting 0-hour work contracts or like longer work weeks, because that would give you, theoretically speaking, the capacity to earn more income and access more happiness. We think that is the type of policy you're more likely to get when you have this short-termist need for more money so you can access more happiness, because how dare a government limit the poor person's capacity to access happiness by working 6 days a week so they can have more money. We think therefore you actually collectively decrease bargaining power more, you collectively decrease worker rights, wages, etc. What this means that even if people are working more hours, they're not necessarily making more money, because that money scales with how much collective bargaining power you have, so you can negotiate wages to actually get access to more income. So very simply then, we think that because you have less collective bargaining, less protections, you also have less government things like healthcare, workplace protections, etc. Their whole argument on risk doesn't matter, because you are removing the safety nets which will always exist, the safety nets of welfare, the safety nets of healthcare and worker protections, and instead replacing them with something they don't even access. So they're not only just pushing the burden on an actor which may not necessarily have the same safety nets they want, but they're also making them less likely to have the very safety nets, because they are pushing them to be more consumers, because they are pushing them to be making less money. Clearly then, panel, if you want to be happier, if you want to be safer financially, you vote for the side of opposition. Very proud to oppose.
Under both sides, people work to make money to live. But under proposition side, people work to make money to be happy. The biggest, strongest, and most important emotion that people actively strive to have in their lives. People now work the most they can to not just be able to sustain themselves by food, etc., and enjoy nice things, but because now it is contingent on the most important emotion that humans try to achieve within a society that is overwhelmingly sad, overwhelmingly stressful. Now proposition is telling them that the best way to get that is through spending your money or through saving it up crazily for the future. We tell you that in a world, a capitalistic society that already pressures you enough to work, already pressures you to do that because, unfortunately, I have to buy absolutely everything to sustain myself. We have one single thing, emotions, happiness, that is not contingent on material welfare. We want to keep the world as it is, a dominant narrative which says that money doesn't buy you happiness. Then I'll be answering two questions in this speech. Firstly, where are people the happiest? And secondly, where do people actually have more money in a meaningful sense? And note that the first question works independently whether proposition gets enough money or whether they're likely to get money, because we tell you it comes at a really, really bad cost. Firstly then, on happiness, because the first thing that they tell you is that there's no trade-off or that there's a minimal trade-off. But we give you three reasons as to why there is. The first is that the narrative feeds on top of the one in capitalism, where capitalism tells you that you consistently need to work more to live, but now this narrative works on top of that and tells you that you need to work in order to be happy, in order to have purpose in your life, and in order for you to be content, the single emotion that humans actively try to go after. Secondly, the fact that there's a lower barrier. Like, yes, it's a more difficult choice to change your job, to explore your passions, for example, or to spend more time with your child than it is to work more, because it seems more immediate, it seems easier. But thirdly, in terms of the time you have to dedicate in order to make significant amount of difference of income for them to be able to pay off entire college tuitions, then that means you have to spend a lot of time. So the trade-off exists. Why does this mean that people are unhappy? We tell you that people work a lot and they lose valuable time with family. This has to do with your close environment, these single human beings that you interact with and give purpose to your life. But secondly, to a more larger extent, we tell you that this can even come at the expense of your mental and physical health, at the point where people commit suicide. And this is real in the world. We see this. The most hardworking work cultural countries that say that the best way for you to be happy is for you to be a good employee are the ones that have a really, really big hustle culture where people commit suicide and there are low birth rates. But thirdly, you feel guilty for something that isn't your fault, because in instances where you cannot make money, you feel like the burden is not just the fact that you failed to sort of give your child a tuition, but you failed to make your child happy and content. This is catastrophic. Proposition tells you that ultimately, it boils down to them being able to save up, but we already addressed that the middle class saves this independently under both sides, because they know that it's important for you to go to college to work. The difference is that you don't save up to go to college because that is the only or best way for you to be content in your life. We're the side that counters this capitalistic narrative and tells you that there's also other ways, which means that if you can save up to go to college and you can save up for that surgery, we're the ones that find other sources of happiness, and that is so much more important. I think that in terms of the magnitude of impact of how people feel and the likelihood of them being happier, we win. But lastly, very quickly then, on which side actually has more money. Because they tell you that first, people are able to work more, and secondly, that you can incentivize welfare. But what we told you, all the way from Hearst, is that firstly, when you have lower worker rights under their side of the house, exactly because of this opportunity cost, exactly because you know it can now come at the expense of your happiness, you're less likely to unionize. You're more likely to be prone to exploitation. Your government is more likely to think that they're wasting taxpayer money at the expense of other people's happiness. But secondly, they never engage with the reality of this motion, which is to say that logically, yes, if you believe that money can buy you happiness, this also means that you spend a lot more, which means that you lose a lot more money at the point where this accumulates over time, plays on your insecurities as a consumer, and tells you that you need to buy things to be happy and give things for yourself. For all of these reasons, happiness is on the side of humanity, on the side of opposition.
Thank you very much for that speech. We will very nicely the proposition to build this debate as a whole.
Sorry, I think I would prefer the podium.
Sorry, I forgot again.
It's okay. Thank you so much. Half of their case is inexclusive and the other half is contradictory. Do not let their strawmanning and rhetoric fool you. Let's start with what is inexclusive. First, their claim on collective bargaining and the race to the bottom is probably inexclusive because if people are so poor and so constrained by economic factors as they claim, they would probably accept bad labor standards on both sides of the house. This narrative probably does not have the influence to change their decision-making on their side. What then is their contradiction? Opposition simultaneously claims that most people are locked out from money and work, but simultaneously claims that people will overwhelmingly turn to work because the barrier is lower than human relationships. It's lower than the human relationship and hobbies, right? If this is true, then we flip their claim on happiness. Yes, it is the fact that people work more, but if this is probably more accessible and leads to them getting more happiness because that is where people are more likely to derive their happiness from on our side. So we win on that metric. They are correct. Relationships are hard and require time and effort. This is why poor individuals working 2 jobs probably cannot easily find this fulfillment on their side of the house. They do not access any of the benefits that they want. 2 things I want to talk about here. First, on people's material lives. Second, on people's happiness, right? Let's first talk about people's material lives. And let's be very clear about the fact that there is a spectrum of socioeconomic conditions across the board. So, okay, there is a constituency of people who are extremely, extremely poor and who they want to weigh. These people will probably probably not be affected by their narrative regardless, right? They're probably not going to get the comfort that you want to access from this because their situations are probably just that bad. You're probably not going to be able to comfort them. They never recognize why. What we did tell you, though, is that there are many, many people in the middle who probably do have some potential to move up, right? This is the group that we weighed from the beginning because it is about your material well-being in the future, about having a good security net when a range of economic shocks happen. For these people, we weighed as really important because working harder actually makes a substantial difference in their lives because this extra income is proportionally large, right? So for instance, this looks like the fact that when you work harder, you do more shifts. That is when your manager notices you and is more likely to promote you up, right? That is when you're probably more likely to be able to make more money. And that is exactly what we wanted for financial independence, to be insulated from shocks. Let's talk about their lack of a comparative then. They say capitalism overworks people and this creates a race to the bottom. How does your narrative likely solve this, right? Clearly, the narrative isn't the cause for why people do this, but rather economic necessity. If that is the case, your narrative is very, very unlikely to solve these strong pressures on either side of the house. On our side of the house, we better allow people to access fulfillment from the fact that, for instance, you're working hard for your family, you're working hard to provide for yourself. I think people are better able to access happiness than on this. On spending then, look, they simply do not understand nuance. We think that your narratives often act on your pre-existing beliefs, right? So for instance, some people are probably brought up quite stingily, other people are taught to be lax. That is what Nicole told you. That is how you're likely to interpret these narratives differently. You get different interpretations of how this works. If you make more money though, we outweigh this. You are probably insulated from these shocks far more. You're better able to spend this money, you're better able to save, you're better able to make more money, you have just more income. So we allow people to be free from all the, more free from the pressures on either side. Let's talk about how happy people are then. And here's where they clearly lose on accessibility. Yes, sometimes there is a trade-off between work and hobbies, but feelings, we think this means that on our side of the house, you're better able to access that happiness, right? You can still access meaning on our side, knowing that you are working hard for your family, as P3 says. And this is where also their lack of a comparative really shoots them in the foot. If you care about poor people so much, this is probably the group of people who cannot engage in hobbies, right? The fact that you probably cannot afford paintings, cannot have the time to do all the hobbies that they want, right? So if you really want people to find meaning through having hobbies or spending time with your friends and family, that is when they do not access this happiness on their side of the house. That is when their narrative is simply ineffective. They do not achieve any of the benefits that they want. On our side of the house, we encourage people to work harder and actually have financial and tangible security for them and their families.